The sky over the Pacific had turned the color of old bruises. It was October 1945, and the war was over. Japan had surrendered 2 months earlier, the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki still haunting the collective consciousness of a world that had just learned what atomic fire could do. But victory hadn't brought peace to everyone. For the men of the 20th Air Force stationed on Guam, the war's end meant different orders: reconnaissance missions, weather observation flights, and the dangerous task of tracking the massive tropical storms that rolled across the Pacific like the fists of angry gods. Captain Howard, Hap, Halverson stood on the tarmac at North Field, squinting at the horizon where the sky met the sea in a blur of gray. The wind had already picked up, pulling at his flight jacket with insistent fingers. Behind him, the B-29 Superfortress designated Key Bird sat like a steel cathedral, her 4 right R-3350 engines silent but waiting. The aircraft was a monument to American industrial might, 99 feet long, with a wingspan that stretched 141 feet, powered by engines that could generate 2,200 horsepower each. She could carry 10 tons of bombs to Tokyo and back. She had been built to destroy cities. Today, she would fly into the heart of a typhoon. "You don't have to do this, Hap." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel James Garrett, the squadron commander, a man whose face had been lined by too many missions over the Japanese mainland. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the darkening sky with the expression of someone who had seen men die for less. Halverson didn't look at him. "Weather Bureau needs the data. Typhoon's tracking toward Okinawa. If we don't get readings from inside the storm, they can't predict where it'll hit. That's a lot of troops on those islands, Jim. It's also a goddamn suicide mission. War's over. Nobody's shooting at us anymore. Nature doesn't give a damn about surrender terms." Halverson finally turned to face his commander. He was 32 years old, with the kind of lean, weathered face that came from growing up in the wheat fields of Nebraska. He had flown 37 combat missions over Japan, had watched Tokyo burn beneath him, had felt the concussion of flak bursts that killed the men in the bomber beside him. He had pressed his bomb release over targets he couldn't see through the smoke, had landed aircraft with engines on fire and hydraulics shot to hell. He wasn't afraid of weather. "I've got a good crew," Halverson said. "Best flight engineer in the Air Force. Navigator who could find a needle in a haystack. We'll punch through, get the readings, and punch back out. 6 hours, tops." Garrett's jaw tightened. Behind them, the ground crew was already warming up Key Bird's engines, the sound building from a whine to a roar that made conversation difficult. The smell of aviation fuel and exhaust filled the humid air. Across the field, other B-29s sat in their revetments, their crews watching with a mixture of relief and pity. Relief that they weren't the ones flying into the storm. Pity because they knew what storms could do. 6 hours, Garrett repeated. He shook his head slowly. "You know what the meteorologists are saying? This thing has sustained winds over 140 miles per hour. Gusts probably reaching 180. The eye is 70 miles wide. It's one of the biggest typhoons they've ever tracked. Then it's important we get the data." "Hap, I'm going, Jim." Halverson's voice was quiet but final. "We're wheels up in 20 minutes. Garrett studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, sharply. "Good luck. And Hap, don't try to be a hero. You get into trouble in there, you turn around. Data isn't worth your lives." "Understood." But both men knew that once you were inside a typhoon, turning around wasn't always an option. Halverson walked toward Key Bird, ducking under the massive wing. His crew was already aboard, 9 men whose lives would depend on his decisions over the next 6 hours. First Lieutenant Robert Chen, the co-pilot, a San Francisco native whose hands were steadier than a surgeon's. Technical Sergeant Mike Wrench Kowalski, the flight engineer, a Polish kid from Detroit who could coax performance out of engines the way a priest coaxes confession. Staff Sergeant Tommy Hayes, the navigator, barely 23 years old but able to calculate dead reckoning positions in his head. The gunners, the radio operator, the bombardier who now operated weather instruments instead of the Norden bombsight. They were young men who had already seen too much. They had burned cities and buried friends. Now they would fly into a storm that could tear their aircraft apart like wet tissue paper. Halverson climbed through the forward hatch, the familiar smell of aluminum and hydraulic fluid and sweat filling his nostrils. The interior of the B-29 was cramped despite the aircraft's size, a maze of cables, conduits, and equipment. He made his way forward to the cockpit, settling into the left seat while Chen took the right. "Weather brief?" Chen asked. "Bad and getting worse." Halverson began running through the pre-flight checklist, his hands moving with practiced efficiency across the panel of switches and gauges. Typhoon centered about 300 miles east-northeast. "We'll fly a direct course, penetrate the outer rain bands, continue to the eye, take our readings, then get the hell out." "Simple," Chen said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. Behind them, Kowalski was monitoring the engine instruments, watching oil pressure and cylinder head temperatures with the intensity of a man whose life depended on those numbers. Because it did. "Engines looking good, Captain. All four running smooth." "Copy that, wrench." The tower's voice crackled through the headset. "Keybird, you're cleared for takeoff, runway 27. Wind 320 at 25, gusting to 40. Altimeter 29.42 and falling. Good luck up there." "Roger, tower." "Keybird rolling." Halverson advanced the throttles, feeling the immense power of 4 engines surging through the airframe. The B-29 began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed as 65 tons of aluminum and steel accelerated down the coral runway. The wind was already trying to push them sideways, and Halverson worked the rudder pedals to keep the nose straight. At 120 miles per hour, he eased back on the yoke, and Keybird lifted into the troubled sky. Below them, Guam fell away, the green jungle and white beaches disappearing into the gray murk. Halverson banked east, climbing through 5,000 feet, then 10,000. The clouds were already building, towering cumulus that rose like mountains of cotton. Lightning flickered in the distance, silent and ominous. "Navigator, give me a heading to the storm center," Halverson said. Hayes's voice came through the intercom. 065 degrees, Captain. Range 280 miles. ETA to outer rain bands, 42 minutes. 42 minutes until they entered hell. The sky ahead was growing darker, the clouds massing into a wall that stretched from the ocean to the stratosphere. The B-29 droned on, engines singing their steady song, carrying 9 men toward a force of nature that had been destroying ships and drowning sailors since before humans had invented the wheel. Halverson's hands rested lightly on the yoke. The instruments glowed softly in the cockpit's dimness. Outside the windows, the world was turning gray. "This is going to be rough, isn't it?" Chen said quietly. Halverson didn't answer. There was nothing to say that they didn't already know. The first raindrops hit the windscreen like bullets. The transition from ordinary bad weather to the outer edges of the typhoon was like crossing an invisible threshold into another world. At first, it was just rain. Heavy rain, the kind that turned the Pacific into a gray sheet and reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. The B-29 punched through it, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the deluge. Water streamed over the canopy in sheets, and the sound of it drumming against the aluminum skin was like being inside a snare drum. Then the turbulence began. "Here we go," Halverson muttered, tightening his shoulder harness. Beside him, Chen did the same, his hands moving to grip the co-pilot's yoke. In the back, Kowalski was calling out to the crew over the intercom, "Secure everything. I mean everything. If it's not bolted down, It's going to be a missile in about 2 minutes. The first jolt came without warning, a violent updraft that threw the B-29 upward like a toy. Halverson's stomach dropped as they climbed 500 feet in seconds, the altimeter spinning, the airspeed fluctuating wildly. Then, just as suddenly, they fell, plummeting through an invisible hole in the sky. The negative G-force lifted Halverson against his harness, loose items floating briefly before the aircraft bottomed out with a shudder that rattled every rivet. "Jesus," Chen breathed. "Just the appetizer," Halverson said, fighting the controls. The yoke was already becoming harder to manage, the air outside no longer smooth and predictable but chaotic, violent, malevolent. The B-29 was designed to fly at high altitude where the air was thin and stable. Down here at 8,000 feet, in the heart of a tropical storm system, it was like trying to pilot a bus through rapids. Lightning exploded off the left wing, a brilliant flash that left afterimages dancing in Halverson's vision. The crack of thunder was instantaneous, so loud it hurt, and for a moment every instrument in the cockpit flickered. The radio squawked with static. "Lost VHF," the radio operator called from the back. "Can't raise Guam." "Keep trying," Halverson ordered. But he knew it didn't matter. They were on their own now, cut off from the world by hundreds of miles and thousands of tons of swirling water vapor. The rain intensified, becoming a solid wall of water that made it impossible to see anything beyond the propeller arc. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines roared on, their 18 cylinders each gulping fuel and air and converting it into power, but even their combined 8,800 horsepower seemed insignificant against the storm's fury. The aircraft shook continuously now, a bone-rattling vibration that came from the wings flexing, the fuselage twisting, the control surfaces fighting forces they were never designed to endure. "Navigator, position check," Halverson called. Hayes's voice was strained. "Dead reckoning puts us 75 miles from the eye center." "But Captain, the winds are insane." "I'm calculating a crosswind component of over 90 knots. We're getting pushed south." "Compensate." "I need an accurate position." "Working on it." Another series of jolts hammered the B-29, each one feeling like they'd hit a speed bump at 200 miles per hour. In the waist section, one of the gunners was vomiting into a bag, the sound carrying over the intercom. No one made jokes. This wasn't normal turbulence. This was nature showing them exactly how small and fragile they were. Halverson glanced at the airspeed indicator. 180 knots. Then 220. Then back down to 160. The winds were doing whatever they wanted with the massive bomber, accelerating it, decelerating it, tossing it around like a leaf. He adjusted the throttles constantly, trying to maintain some semblance of stable flight, but it was like wrestling an alligator. "Engines still good?" he asked Kowalski. "So far. Oil temps are climbing because we're working them hard, but we're still in the green. Number 3's running a little rough, probably ingesting water, but it's holding. Keep an eye on it." The sky outside had turned an eerie yellow-green, the color of a bruise, the color of violence. The clouds were no longer individual formations, but a continuous mass, rotating slowly, malevolently, around the distant eye. Rain fell horizontally now, driven by winds that had to be exceeding 100 miles per hour. The B-29's windshield was useless, just a blur of water and occasional terrifying glimpses of cloud formations racing past. Then the hail started. The first stones hit the aircraft like gunfire, sharp cracks that made everyone jump. Small at first, marble-sized, but growing larger. Within 30 seconds, ice chunks the size of golf balls were hammering the bomber, a sound like 100 jackhammers working simultaneously. The noise was deafening. "Wing inspection," Halverson shouted. "Chen, check your side." Both pilots craned their necks, trying to see the wings through the maelstrom. The leading edges were taking a beating, ice and water streaming over the metal. But so far, the structure was holding. Boeing had built these aircraft tough, designed them to absorb battle damage. But they'd never imagined this. A massive updraft caught them, and the altimeter spun wildly as they rocketed upward. 10,000 feet. 12,000. 15,000. Halvorsen pushed the yoke forward, throttling back, trying to arrest the climb before they exceeded structural limits. The airspeed was dropping dangerously as the nose pitched up, and he could feel the aircraft approaching a stall. "Come on, baby," he whispered, fighting the controls. "Stay with me." The artificial horizon had tumbled, useless. He was flying purely on instinct and the few instruments that still made sense. Airspeed, altimeter, vertical speed. Everything else was chaos. At 17,000 feet, they finally broke through the top of the updraft and entered calmer air. For about 10 seconds. Then they hit the downdraft. The bottom dropped out. The B-29 fell like a stone, plummeting through the sky at rates that maxed out the vertical speed indicator at 6,000 feet per minute. Halvorsen pulled back on the yoke, adding power, but they were in the grip of forces that made mockery of human engineering. Down they went, falling through their own altitude, through clouds that tore past the windows in gray streaks. 8,000 feet. 6,000. 4,000. Pull up, pull up. Chen was shouting, though Halvorsen was already doing everything possible. The engines screamed at full power, the airframe groaning under the stress. At 2,500 feet, they finally arrested the descent, bottoming out so hard that Halvorsen felt his spine compress. Someone in the back was praying in Spanish. Someone else was cursing. Both seemed appropriate. "Damage report," Halvorsen called, his voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Kowalski's response took a moment. "Checking. Captain, I'm seeing some fluctuations in hydraulic pressure. System A is dropping. Not critical yet, but it's losing fluid somewhere." Hydraulic system A controlled the primary flight controls, ailerons, elevators, rudder. If it failed completely, they'd be flying on the backup system, which was smaller, weaker, less responsive. In smooth air, manageable. In this, potentially fatal. Can you isolate the leak? Negative. Could be anywhere in the system. Probably got nicked by hail. Wonderful, Chen muttered. The rain was coming from all directions now, driven by winds that had no single direction. The B-29 was being pushed, pulled, lifted, dropped, twisted. Halvorsen's arms ached from fighting the controls. Sweat ran down his face despite the cold. Outside, the world had become an abstract painting of gray and black and terrible movement. Hayes called up from his navigation station. "Captain, by my calculations we should be within 20 miles of the eye. But I can't be certain. The winds have been pushing us all over the sky." 20 miles. Under normal conditions, that was 4 minutes of flight. In this storm, it could be 4 minutes or 40. Time had lost meaning, stretched and compressed by the violence around them. Lightning struck again, this time hitting the aircraft directly. The flash was blinding, the cracks simultaneous and overwhelming. Every light in the cockpit went out for a heartbeat, then flickered back on. Halvorsen's skin tingled with electricity. The smell of ozone filled the cabin. "Still here," he said, checking the instruments frantically. Everything seemed to be working, though several gauges were now fluctuating erratically. The compass was spinning uselessly, the magnetic field disrupted by the electrical discharge. "Number 3 engine." Kowalski's voice was sharp. "Losing RPM." Halvorsen's eyes snapped to the engine instruments. Number 3, the inboard engine on the right wing, was indeed winding down, the RPM dropping from 2,400 to 2,100 to 1,800. The cylinder head temperature was spiking. "What's happening?" "Don't know. Could be water ingestion. Could be electrical damage from the lightning strike. I'm trying to wait. It's recovering. RPM coming back up." The engine stuttered, coughed, then caught again, the RPM climbing back toward normal. But it was running rough now, vibrating badly enough that they could feel it through the airframe. "Keep 3 turning," Halvorsen ordered. "We need all the power we can get." The turbulence was worsening, each jolt stronger than the last. The B-29 was being hammered from all sides, shaken like a dog with a rag toy. In the back, equipment was breaking loose despite the crew's best efforts. Halvorsen heard crashes, curses, the sound of metal hitting metal. And then, through a gap in the clouds, he saw it. The eye. It was perhaps 10 miles ahead, a cylinder of clear air punching through the storm like a tunnel through a mountain. Sunlight, actual sunlight, was visible within it, golden and surreal. The walls of the eye were vertical clouds that rose to impossible heights, rotating slowly, majestically, like the walls of some vast atmospheric cathedral. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Halvorsen had ever seen. "There," he pointed. "We're going in." But between them and that island of calm lay the eye wall, the most violent part of any hurricane or typhoon, where winds reached their maximum velocity and the convection was most intense. It was a wall of weather that had destroyed ships and aircraft, that had killed thousands. And they were about to fly directly into it. The eye wall hit them like a freight train. One moment they were in heavy turbulence and driving rain. The next, they had entered a realm of such violent chaos that everything before seemed mild by comparison. The wind shift was instantaneous and catastrophic, a 90-degree change in direction that caught the B-29 broadside and heeled it over like a sailboat in a gale. Halvorsen hauled on the yoke with both hands, feet jamming the rudder pedals, fighting to bring the wings level. The aircraft rolled 30 degrees, 40, 50. Alarms were screaming. The artificial horizon had completely tumbled. Chen was on the controls too, both pilots straining against forces that should not exist at 8,000 feet. "Full power!" Halvorsen roared. "All engines, full power!" Kowalski shoved the throttles to the firewall. The 4 right cyclones howled in response, but the airspeed indicator was swinging wildly between 140 knots and 240 knots as they were alternately stalled and accelerated by winds that exceeded anything in the aircraft's design specifications. The wings were flexing visibly, bending up and down by feet, the aluminum skin rippling like water. The rain was no longer falling. It was being hurled horizontally at speeds over 160 miles per hour, each drop hitting with the force of a bullet. The windshield was already cracking, spiderwebs of fractures spreading across the plexiglass. Hail the size of baseballs hammered the aircraft, each impact a thunderous boom. And then came the sound that every pilot dreads. Metal tearing. "What was that?" Chan shouted over the cacophony. Kowalski's voice came through the intercom, tight with controlled panic. "Port side elevator. The trim tab just separated. I can see it, the whole goddamn trim tab is gone." The elevator trim tab was a small control surface on the trailing edge of the horizontal stabilizer, used to fine-tune the aircraft's pitch. Losing it meant the elevator itself was now unbalanced, subjected to aerodynamic forces that would try to twist it off its hinges. And without the elevator, they couldn't control pitch. They couldn't climb or descend in any controlled manner. "Can we compensate?" Halvorsen demanded, already feeling the change in how the aircraft was handling. The nose wanted to pitch down now, and he had to pull back harder on the yoke to maintain level flight. "Maybe," Chen said, "but if we lose the whole elevator." "We're not going to lose it. Reduce power to 2,000 revolutions per minute. Slower airspeed means less stress on the surfaces. Slower airspeed also means we might not have enough power to fight through these winds." "Do it." The engines throttled back, and immediately the B-29 began losing altitude. They were being pushed down by the descending air in the eye wall, sinking at 1,500 feet per minute despite Halvorsen's best efforts. 7,000 feet. 6,500. 6,000. The turbulence was beyond comprehension. The aircraft was being thrown in all directions simultaneously. Up, down, left, right, with violent twisting motions that stressed the fuselage beyond anything the engineers at Boeing had imagined. Halvorsen could hear rivets popping, the sound like gunfire. Somewhere in the back, a man was screaming. Lightning exploded all around them, strike after strike, turning the interior of the storm into a strobe-lit hellscape. Thunder was continuous, a rolling explosion that never stopped. The air itself seemed alive with electricity. St. Elmo's fire danced along the propeller blades, crawled across the windshield, glowed eerily on the wingtips. 5,000 feet, Chen called out. Halvorsen, we're getting too low. The ocean was down there somewhere, hidden beneath the storm, waiting. At their current rate of descent, they had maybe 3 minutes before they'd be swimming. I know. I'm working on it. But the controls were becoming less responsive. The damaged elevator was causing the aircraft to mush, to wallow through the air like a drunk. Every input Halvorsen made had to be exaggerated, and even then the response was sluggish, delayed. Another series of violent updrafts caught them, throwing the B-29 upward like a cork in rapids. The G-forces pressed them into their seats, 2 Gs, then 3. Halvorsen felt his vision tunneling, blood draining from his head. Then they were falling again, weightless, stomachs in throats, anything not secured floating in the cabin. Number 3's on fire. Kowalski's shout cut through the chaos. Halvorsen's eyes snapped to the engine instruments. Number 3, already running rough, was now showing cylinder head temperatures in the red zone. Through the rain-streaked side window, he could see orange flames licking back from the cowling, streaming behind the engine nacelle. Shut it down. Fire suppression now. Activating bottle. Kowalski hit the fire extinguisher switch, sending CO2 flooding into the engine compartment. The flames hesitated, diminished, but didn't fully extinguish. They were burning now on residual fuel in the cowling, and with the wind speeds, the fire was being driven back toward the wing route. If it reached the fuel tanks, they would explode. Feather 3. Halvorsen ordered. The propeller blades rotated edge-on to the wind, reducing drag from the dead engine. But now they were down to 3 engines in the worst storm any of them had ever experienced, with damaged flight controls and a fire that might or might not be out. The aircraft lurched violently to the right as the asymmetric thrust tried to roll them. Halvorsen stood on the left rudder pedal, both hands on the yoke, arms trembling with the effort of keeping wings level. They were yawing, sliding sideways through the sky, being pushed by winds that treated a 65-ton bomber like a kite. Haze. Halvorsen called. How far to the eye? I don't know. I can't get a reading. We could be 5 miles out or 15. Another massive jolt, and this time they heard it clearly, a long tearing screech of metal separating from metal. Starboard aileron. Chen was staring out his side window, his face gone white. Jesus Christ, the aileron is coming off. Halvorsen looked right and felt his heart stop. The starboard aileron, the control surface that allowed them to roll the aircraft, was partially detached. The outboard end had torn free from its hinges and was now flapping in the 180-mile-per-hour wind like a flag, held on only by the internal control cables. As he watched, another hinge failed, and the aileron bent backward at an impossible angle, the metal shrieking. "I'm losing roll control," Halvorsen said, his voice tight. The yoke was becoming useless in his hands. He tried to input a left roll, and nothing happened. Tried right, the damaged aileron just flopped loosely. They were in the eye wall of the most powerful Typhoon in a generation, at 5,000 feet, with one engine dead, one engine on fire, elevator trim gone, and now an aileron tearing off. The situation had gone from dangerous to unsurvivable in the span of 30 seconds. "We need to get out of this," Chan shouted. "Turn around. Get out of the storm. We're in the eye wall. There is no out. We have to make it to the eye. It's our only chance." But even as he said it, Halverson wasn't sure they would make it. The B-29 was barely controllable, wallowing through the sky more like a submarine than an aircraft. Every control input was a gamble. The wings were still flexing, the fuselage groaning, and he could hear more rivets popping throughout the structure. A violent updraft seized them, and this time the forces were stronger than anything before. The vertical speed indicator maxed out at 6,000 feet per minute climb. Halverson felt himself pressed into the seat with crushing force as they rocketed upward. 6,000 feet. 8,000. 10,000. The airspeed was dropping dangerously. 150 knots, 140, 130. "We're going to stall," Chan warned. Halverson pushed the nose down, adding what power he dared from the 3 remaining engines. But the updraft wouldn't let them go. They continued climbing, the airspeed continuing to decay. 120 knots. 110. The stall warning horn began to blare. At 14,000 feet, the B-29 finally stalled. The nose dropped like a stone, and suddenly they were in an uncontrolled descent, falling through the sky in a spiraling dive. The controls were useless. The artificial horizon spun crazily. Outside the windows, the world was a sickening rotation of gray cloud, darker cloud, occasional terrifying glimpses of the ocean far below. "Pull up! Pull up!" Chan was hauling back on his yoke, but without airspeed, without control authority, they might as well have been pulling on car steering wheels. Halverson forced himself to stay calm. Stall recovery, reduce angle of attack, add power, let the aircraft accelerate. He pushed the yoke forward, counterintuitive when you're falling toward the ocean, but necessary. Advanced the throttles on the 3 good engines. 12,000 feet. 10,000. 8,000. The airspeed was building. 140 knots, 160, 180. He could feel the controls starting to respond again, the airflow over the surfaces giving him authority. He eased back on the yoke, gently, trying to arrest the dive without stalling again. 6,000 feet. 5,000. 4,000. "Come on, baby," he whispered. "Come on." At 3,200 feet, the nose finally came up. The spiral stopped. They were level again, or as level as you could be in a Typhoon, flying on 3 engines with damaged flight controls. But they were still alive. "Status!" Halverson barked. Kowalski's voice was shaky. "Fires out on number 3. But we've lost all hydraulic pressure in System A. We're flying on System B only. If that fails—" "It won't fail, Captain, realistically. It won't fail because we won't let it fail." Another series of jolts hammered them, but Halverson thought, maybe, the violence was decreasing slightly. The rain seemed fractionally less intense. The turbulence still savage, but not quite as savage. And then, like passing through a curtain, they broke into the eye. The transformation was instantaneous and miraculous. One moment they were in howling wind and sideways rain and chaos. The next, they were in air that, while not calm, was merely rough instead of apocalyptic. The rain stopped. The visibility extended to miles instead of meters. Above them, impossibly blue sky. Around them, walls of cloud rising to 40,000 feet, rotating slowly in a circle miles wide. The eye of the Typhoon, an island of relative peace at the center of the storm. Halverson didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until he let it out in a long, shaky exhale. "We're through," Chen said, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "We actually made it through." But the celebration was premature. Kowalski's voice cut in. "Captain, we have major damage. The starboard aileron is hanging by the control cables only. All 3 hinges have failed. Port elevator trim tab is completely gone. We have fractures in the windshield. Multiple skin panels have buckled. We're leaving a trail of hydraulic fluid. And we still have to fly back out through that." He paused. "Sir, I don't think we can make it." Halvorson looked around the eye. It was perhaps 50 miles across, a cylinder of relatively calm air surrounded by the eye wall, that ring of maximum violence they just barely survived. The ocean below was visible now, an angry gray expanse of waves that had to be 40 feet high, driven by the circular winds. To get home, they would have to penetrate the eye wall again, in an aircraft that was already falling apart, with control surfaces hanging loose, with one engine dead. It would be like trying to walk back through a minefield where you'd already stepped on one mine and survived by luck. Hayes called up, "Captain, we've got another problem. I've been calculating our fuel burn. Fighting through those winds, we used a lot more fuel than planned. Even if we fly a direct course back to Guam." He hesitated. "We might not make it. We could run dry 50, maybe 70 miles short." So those were the choices: stay in the eye until they ran out of fuel and ditched in 40-foot seas, or try to fly back through the eye wall in a crippled aircraft and probably break apart in mid-air. Halvorson looked at Chen, at the damaged controls, at the 3 engines still running, at the blue sky above that was like a gift from God, temporary and precious. He made his decision. "We're going home," he said quietly. "Hayes, give me a course to Guam. Kowalski, I need you to transfer all available fuel to the main tanks, every drop. Chen, help me trim this bird out. We're going to fly as efficiently as possible." He paused. "And everyone, tighten your harnesses. When we hit that eye wall again, it's going to be rough." "Rough?" Chen repeated hollowly. "That's one word for it." Through the clear air of the eye, Halvorson could see the eye wall ahead, a wall of churning gray cloud that stretched from ocean to stratosphere. Somewhere in that wall was a gap, a section slightly less violent than the rest, though calling any part of it less violent was like calling one bullet less deadly than another. They turned toward it, 3 engines pulling them forward, control surfaces barely holding together, hydraulic fluid streaming behind them like blood. Going home, or dying in the attempt.